Well, welcome again. As we talked about during the welcome time, we are going to start this journey together about kind of looking at what is it discipleship, what does it look like to do discipleship in an intentional way, what does it look like to nurture our relationship between us and God, and if we think about that in terms of journey, which is my favorite metaphor for it, mostly because I like to travel, and I'm definitely, as you have found out, a getting there is all the fun kind of guy, right? We live in Colorado, and there are mountains and trails, so this is something I think we understand, right? It's just a really helpful metaphor. So we're going to go on this journey together about discovering discipleship, and we're going to stop at kind of various destinations you may stop at across the way. I have to present them to you in some sort of order, because Sundays come every week in order. But you won't necessarily, I'm not saying this is the order everyone goes through in their discipleship journey, so don't think that when we're going through all this together. But we had to start somewhere, and it's always good in my mind, if you're going to talk about discipleship, to start with, God. Call me crazy. All right. So that's what we're going to do this morning. But first, I was listening to a podcast recently. I listen to a lot of podcasts on my really hectic commutes to work in the morning. If you don't know, I live across the street. So I have to invent ways to get here that take me far away and then come back. But I listen to podcasts, and I was listening to a podcast recently where they were talking about just how big the universe is, and in case we all forgot. Right? And it's not one of those things I spend a lot of time thinking about. I mean, you learn this and you know this, and people have big telescopes and they've been looking out into the stars and they say, man, these things are really far away and the universe is really, really big. And I was reminded of that recently to listen to this podcast about how big the universe is. And we know something about this as people. Like, we have ventured out there a little bit. Over the summer, we talked about the fact that we did, as people, go to the moon, which is pretty cool, right? I mean, I didn't get to go, and I don't think any of you did. If you did, I'd like to know that. But we went to the moon, and of course, it took like 2 full days flying at an incredible speed to get from the Earth to the moon, where they were just kind of hanging out there in space, like just doing stuff. I don't know what you do. Maybe they brought a checkerboard with them. I don't know. I'm sure they were doing much more interesting things. But, so we know that. So we know the moon's there, and you can look up in the sky and you can see it. But, it looks pretty small, but it's actually pretty big because it's really far away, right? So we've done that. We do have one thing that we have made as human beings that have actually left the solar system. I'm going to geek out for a minute here, and you're all just going to put up with it because you're nice. So we sent this thing called Voyager, a few decades ago, and it has gone so far that it's actually left the boundaries of what we know as the solar system. It still occasionally sends these little messages back to us, so we still know it's there. And that is the furthest, man-made object from us, and it's barely left the solar system. Now, though, we have actually sent something further away from us than Voyager, and that is all of the different kind of radio and television signals that we have been generating over the last, say, 100-ish years, right? Those signals mostly populate around here, but some of that radio doesn't stay here. It goes out into the ether and is expanding out there. And I looked it up because I was curious, and sure enough, if that's our galaxy, that small little yellow dot in the corner has, after about 100-ish years going the speed of light, how far we have gotten out into the universe, which is not particularly far, right? Because our galaxy is really, really big. Now, while I was researching, I did have a thought that occurred to me while I was thinking about this, which is, if somewhere out there, we have these giant telescopes that we're looking at the universe, trying to see if there's anybody trying to talk to us. If there is anybody out there doing the same thing, trying to listen for signals from us, it's a really good chance that first contact from human beings to them is going to be howdy doody. I'm not sure we thought that through. Because should these signals ever get anywhere interesting that somebody's listening to and they decide to visit us, they will have been watching years and years and years of our television by the time they get here, and I kind of wonder if they'll just turn around. Be like, no, there's no intelligent life there. We don't want to. But that is our farthest hemisphere. All this radio and TV that we've been doing for all these decades, that's the farthest thing from us. Because the universe is just so very big. Our own galaxy is very big, and then there are lots and lots and lots and lots of galaxies. And every time they point a telescope up into space, they just keep finding more, right? And this was interesting. Like anytime I encounter, this is a fact that, I know and I've encountered before. And I was listening to this podcast, and it leads to this moment where you feel both really interested by it, and you can't really wrap your brain around, how big it is. And then you kind of have a couple of choices about how you want to respond. And one of the choices you can make is to just think, man, I'm really insignificant, right? Like I just did all this out there. Like, do I really matter? Does it matter? Does it matter that I'm here? Like, does anything matter? Right? So you can go down that path. The other thing you can think is you can think of all this vastness and all this stuff is out there, and I get to be part of it, right? That for whatever reason, the universe still needed me. The universe still needed you. The universe wouldn't be the universe if you weren't here, right? So we really kind of have a choice. We can either be like, oh, in the face of all this vastness and craziness, either I'm insignificant and I don't matter, or we can have an opportunity to be grateful that we get to be part of this amazing universe, grateful that we get to be here, we get to be in the world, we get to learn and love other people, we get to love, we get to experience love, we get to have all of this amazing things. Look how much creation it took so that we got to be here to enjoy our piece of it. How awesome is that? How amazing is that? How do we learn to have gratitude for that? As humans, we're used to dealing with things that are kind of finite and easy to kind of wrap our heads around, so that when we encounter things that are big and expansive and hard to wrap our heads around, right, we struggle. And this isn't just new. This isn't just since the invention of the telescope, right? Even the earliest people struggled with this. I mean, right? They would stand on beaches and look out over kind of like vast oceans, right? And the earliest folks didn't really have boats. They couldn't go explore. They didn't know it was out there, right? I mean, we live in a time where we can get in our car and we can drive. And how many miles did you drive, Jim? You told me in the last week and a half? 3,500 miles, right? Like that is a very contemporary thing to do. Like for thousands of years, people couldn't do that. You would be lucky to travel 2,500 miles in your lifetime, right? Let alone over a week and a half. So when you would stand like on a shore and look out over the vastness of the ocean with no hope of going anywhere on the other side of it, or you would stand on the top of a mountain, which would be more probably what you do in this part of the world, right? If you stand on top of a 14er and look out over the creation, right, there was for centuries and centuries and millennia, people wouldn't have any hope of ever going beyond what they could see, but they knew there was more world out there. They had heard tell of it, but they would likely never see it or experience it. We have been dealing with like the vastness of creation as long as there have been people, right? So this isn't new to us. So I bring all this up for a reason. You really hope there's a reason. I know. I can see that. You're like, he might be going somewhere. So when we have, we just finished this Moses series. We deal with kind of very early stories of God's people. God's people early on, those earliest folks that called themselves God people, used to do some really weird things that their neighbors didn't understand. And what the earliest of God's people would do is they would go around and they would say things like, there is only one God, and that God is the God of everything, right? Well, this flew in the face of convention at the time, right? Nobody really thought that. Like gods were kind of geographically bound, right? And so in the time that, the very earliest of God's people are doing what they're doing and learning and proclaiming and talking about this God that they know and worship, everyone else has kind of this God that's kind of bound geographically to where they are. And so these early followers, these early Jews would do really weird things. Like if they got in conflict with somebody, they would actually bring their God with them into wherever it was
that the conflict was going to take place. Nobody did this, right? Everybody else's gods were back home, right? Because that's not how gods work, right? And so here come these Jews, here comes these early people of God who are really like kind of a minor people from a backwater of the Near East. Like, no, we brought our God with us. Our God comes with us because our God is everywhere. There is one God, and that God is everywhere. And we are God's people everywhere. That was a really weird and bizarre claim that they made that nobody else was making at the time. But this is where we come to. This is where we come from. This is our faith tradition comes out of this really kind of crazy, bizarre claim that there is a God. There is a God not only of like this church. There isn't just a God of this room, but there's like a God of the entire world. And every time we learned that the world was a little bigger than we thought it was, and a little bit farther than we thought it was, when we showed up at that new place that we'd never been before, we came with this expectation that God was already there, and that God was with us as we went there. Wherever we went, however far we went, we always understood that we couldn't go so far that God couldn't find us. This is kind of the central claim of faith that people in our faith tradition have made from the beginning. And for some of us, it's the water we swim in. It's something that we've understood forever and always, and we never really had the idea, like, well, certainly God's with us in Colorado, but when you go to Nebraska, that's something different. I decided not to pick on Wyoming because I was getting grief about picking on Wyoming so much. So now we're picking on Nebraska. Oh, fine. There you go. Yeah. But lost you already. All right, good job. But this is what we do. We don't think that. Right? We never have, right? Like, some of it, I've been blessed already to be able to travel in life, in many various places. And when you show up in these places, like, you always show up with this expectation. It's just baked into who I am. I'm like, oh, well, yes, of course, I expect to find God in these far-flung places because the God that I know, the God that knows me, is the God not just of my church or not just my God of me, but is the God of the world, the God of the entire universe. Right? And yet that God of the entire universe also knows who I am. That God of the whole universe is glad that I am in it. And that God of the whole universe loves me and calls me to love others. Right? So what do we do when we are confounded and we're confronted with that idea? That idea that there is a God of the whole universe. There's a God that's taking care of not just us in this place, but everybody. But that God is so big and so amazing that God can take care of everybody while also taking care of you. And that God who's having a relationship with your neighbor wants to have one with you as well. Right? That is a big, meaty, bold claim we make as peoples of faith. And we have the same kind of confrontation with it that we get to have when we think about how big the universe is. We can either say, well, God is so big and so amazing and taking care of so things, I'm insignificant and it doesn't matter. Or we can go, God is big and God is amazing and God is taking care of all kinds of things and God's also part of my life. And God loves me too. And I'm going to be grateful and excited and happy that I get to be one of the things that God loves. That's the choice. That's the choice we make as people of faith. And of course, I try to choose on a regular basis to be grateful for what God does. Now, John, who is the author of today's letter, and we're not sure actually if today's letter, it was a letter or if it was a sermon or what it was, but John wrote this, and he's wrote it to his community because there's a problem in his community. And so John set up shop in Ephesus, which is a fun word to say. It is. You should try it. Ephesus. There you go. Good job. Some of you follow instructions. So John, most of John's community that he set up shop with after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus was in Ephesus, and he had this community there. And this community went through, was thriving, doing well, but then went through a division over this idea of who God is and who Jesus is. And these folks came into John's community and convinced of some of them that, really what God is interested in is the spiritual world. God doesn't care about the physical world. Thus, Jesus couldn't have actually been here in body. Jesus could only have been here in spirit because God only cares about the spirit, and God doesn't care about the body or what you do with the body. And so they came and they taught this, and the young people said, "Sure, that makes sense." And it began to build this division within the church. And this division between in John's community to the point where some of these folks who believed this way left. And of course, John's probably sitting there like I hung out with Jesus, right? Like you think John must have been thinking this, right? Like, we had meals together. Like we hung out for like a good solid 3 years. Like if he wasn't a physical being, I think I would have noticed. Right? Like that's kind of John's through line in this whole thing. But the other thing that they kind of brought with them also was this kind of weird understanding of what it means, what love is in terms of what we think about love in terms of God and Jesus and Christ. And because, you can't really get around the fact that Jesus talked a lot about it, and that this whole concept of loving and being loved and loving others is kind of a big deal to Jesus. So what they did is they tried to kind of redefine what it is that Jesus meant when he said love. And Jesus, and to them, they were like, Jesus didn't mean, bodily things, and he didn't mean people, he didn't mean any of that. He just meant, this small group of folks. He just meant, the spiritual side of you. God doesn't care about any of the rest of it. And so John's got to go and correct all this and basically like, no. Like, hold on, I was there, right? Let me tell you how this works. Right? And so he writes this, the first of several either letters or sermons. We're not sure how they originally were. And he goes on in chapter 4 on this huge thing about love. Right? And he gives us this kind of all-encompassing idea of what it means to love and what it is that God meant about love. And the idea that if you wanted to experience God, and if you weren't one of the lucky ones running around who got to hang out with Jesus the way that John did, and most people didn't, right? If you missed that opportunity and somehow you wanted to experience what it was to be with God or what it is to experience God, then you need to look no further than the process of loving and being loved. Because when you are involved in that, whether it's your parent or your child, or whether it's your spouse or your neighbor, whoever it is, right? When you are amidst and among loving and showing love and receiving love, then you are amongst God, right? Then that you will find God there, even if you don't know or can't say that that's what it is. Even if you don't have those words yet, that's how we experience who God is. And it's not limited, and it's not just one piece of us and not the other. It's God actually cares about the whole person. God cares about the whole community. God cares about all of us. God cares about all God's children. And when you love and return love for the love you receive, then you are experiencing what it is. You are literally experiencing the reality of God in your life. How amazing is that, right? And so we have a choice. What are we going to do about this? We're going to say, gosh, I'm insignificant. I can't really do anything. How am I going to love anybody? Nobody loves me. Or are we going to be grateful for the thing and the opportunity that we have been given to really embody God and embody Christ in the world in how we show, give, and receive the love that's being offered? Now, this happens in big ways all the time. It happens in families and all the time. There's all these big stories about it. But John wants to be clear. It's not just in big things, and it's little things. And sometimes it happens in the craziest places, like McDonald's. It can happen there. So a couple of years ago, it was on a Father's Day. There was a woman who was ordering food in McDonald's and saw in her rearview mirror that there was a father and like 4 kids in the car in line behind her. And it was Father's Day, and so she said to the gal, okay, I'm going to pay for my food, and I'm going to pay for the food of that poor guy and those 4 kids behind me, right? And the gal goes, okay, well, that's very nice. So she does, and she pays for the guy behind him, and the guy behind him rolls up, and she's like, hey, your food's taken care of. The person in front of you got it. He's like, oh, okay. Now, you probably say, that's great, because I got 4 screaming kids in my car, and I'm out of here. But he didn't. Instead, he said, okay, well, who's behind me? I will pay for them, right? And she's like, oh, okay, well, that's okay. And then that guy pulls up, and he's like, all right, well, what's going on? I'm like, oh, this person in front of you paid for you. And he's like, okay, great. Great. I will pay for the person behind me. And it just kept going. And it actually went going, and I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. Let's see. It ended up being a chain of 167 people long. You do kind of be like, who's the one who stopped it? Because we should invite them to church. All right. And this happens and the most funny thing is like this, there are no end of stories like this. I just Googled it. There's no end of stories like this. There was recently a chain at Starbucks that lasted for 10 hours and 458 people. Right? This has actually happened to me. We pulled into a Starbucks once, Dan and I, and we ordered some coffee, and we handed her my card, and then she took it. I handed her a card, and she didn't take it. She's like, oh, the person in front of you got your order. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's great. And then she goes to hand us her coffee, and I'm like, well, what about the people behind us? And she looked at the screen, she's like, oh, they had like 5 things, so it's okay. And then she closed her window. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, you're kind of putting me in a spot here. And so we did. Like, I guess we're not getting that guy stuff. But it's, because here's the thing is, when we put love into the world, big ways or small ways, whether it's just the one person behind us who just gets to have a little better day, or 167 people who get to be blessed in a day, whether it's just that hug that we give because we think the person needs it and we don't think about it again, or whatever it is, when we are in the business of receiving and putting love into the world, then we are in the God business, right? Because that is what we are to do, and that's what we are to be about, because God loved us. God loved us so much that God came. God shows up quite a bit if you read the Old Testament to remind us where we're messing up, right? And apparently we still didn't get it. So God's Son came to remind us again of what it is that we were supposed to do. And when we ask the question over and over again, God said, how much are we supposed to love God? Jesus, how much are we supposed to love? Christ showed us by going as far as a person can go for love. Christ went to the cross, died, and came back again, and basically said, any questions? Any questions about how much you're supposed to love and what this whole thing is about? Because I don't know that I can give you a better example than what I just did. So John is saying that to his community. When we were in the love business, we were in the God business. That's what being a disciple and a follower of Christ means. It's the most important thing about who we are. And when we are in the business of putting love into the world and we are in the business of receiving love, we are in the God business. And we are in the discipleship business. And we are becoming even more the creation and the creatures that God wants us to be. So this is where we start our journey of discipleship, with this fundamental idea that there is a God of the entire universe. There is a God putting things in order. There is a God trying to bring some order into a world that we love to make messy. And that God is trying to bring order to our lives and love into our lives that we, let's be honest, really like to make messy. That's who we are as people of faith. That's who we are as disciples. And that is what fuels us on the journey we have moving forward. Amen.